Okay, we're going to start just a few minutes early because our presenter has a lot of slides. And that's amazing news for us. Good afternoon and welcome to the David Schroeder series in Music, History, and Culture. This is our first lecture for the season. Before we begin with the paper itself, I'd like to acknowledge that Dalhousie is located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and we are all privileged to be treaty people. Our speaker today is our very own Professor Jennifer Bain, who I'm to introduce. So even though we all know Dr. Bain, I'll say a few things about her magnificent accomplishments. So Dr. Bain is an expert, world-leading expert in medieval chant, medieval music more generally, especially the music of Guillaume Machaut, and most recently, I think in the last decade or so, she's turned to digital tools for chant research, and you can see that the title of the talk today is along those lines. She is author of a book published by Cambridge University Press called Hildegard of Bingen, The Musical Reception, the Modern Revival of a Medieval Composer. She has also authored a great many articles and journal articles and encyclopedia articles as well on topics related to this project and medieval music as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Bain.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be presenting today in the David Schroeder Music and Culture Lecture Series. David chaired the committee that hired me, so I'm always very grateful to him. And I'm really pleased to be able to tell you about my recent research. So today I'm going to be talking, as Estelle said, about digital tools for musical analysis, specifically medieval chant, and a little more specifically the music of Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard was a 12th century composer, and I'll also be telling you a little bit about how her music relates to other music from that period in the same genre. So you'll see that there are several names on the title slide. So while I'm presenting, this is work that has been part of a team project where I've been working with Kate Helson, who's a musicologist and chant scholar at Western University, and with Mark Daly, who's a computer scientist at Western, and Jake Schindler, who was an undergraduate student at Western in music, but also did some computer science, and he's been working with our data. So I am presenting really on behalf of all of us. So really what our project asks is this question about what makes Hildegard's music distinctive. Her music is frequently described as distinctive in all kinds in textbooks and journal articles, in the popular press, and reviews of her music. And I've been perhaps a little bit obsessed with this question actually for quite a while, and I've used a lot of different manual approaches to try to answer that question. So one of the things I've looked at is range. So something that a lot of writers say is that her music has a very wide range and much wider than other chant from that period. And in a couple of articles, I talked a lot about how performances of her music make us think that it has a wider range than it does, because it's often placed very high in the female voice and with very kind of ecstatic performance styles. And so it gives us that sense. But I wanted to see, is it really wider? So I compared her music with the music of Hermannus Contractus, who was a composer working about 100 years before Hildegard in the same region as she was. And there are actually quite a few similarities between their music. They both really emphasize the final. In modern terms, we might think of that as the tonic of a key, as well as the fifth and the octave. Those are really kind of structural moments in their works. If we take a look and compare then how they approach range, we can see that most of their chants for both of them fall in the range of a tenth or 11th. What we can see Hildegard doing is sort of pushing more that upper extreme. Everybody always says And her music even extends to 2.5 octaves. There's one chant that extends to 2.5 octaves, and actually the theme of that chant, the text, is referring to angels. So I think there's actually a really clear reason why that would happen. Hermanus, on the other hand, spends more time kind of on that lower range of the 8th to 9th. So she's falling within the norms, but definitely pushing things a bit to the extreme. The other thing that I've written about that she does that does really make her music stand out, very distinctive from other works of that period, is her approach to the structure of sequences and hymns. Sequences and hymns in the medieval period are highly, highly structured poetic forms. So the typical medieval hymn structure, it's actually also the modern hymn structure and the structure you see in lots of folk songs as well. You have multiple stanzas, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, it could go up to 12 or 14. And you have one melody that gets repeated from one stanza to the next. And what that means is that the stanzas, the texts, have also a very structured format. The same number of syllables per line in every line of the stanza, and often a rhyme scheme. In the Middle Ages, sometimes there's a rhyme scheme, sometimes there isn't. But what you really hear is this melody keeps coming back, and it's not often in the manuscripts, you don't get the melody written out a second or a third or a fourth time, because once you know the melody, you can apply the stanza very easily to the melody because the syllable structure is so precise. The typical medieval sequence structure, there's a similarity to it. You get the repetition of melody, but now it's in pairs. So you get what usually they refer to verses or lines. It could be quite a long line, but rather than a stanza. So you get one line, 1A, a second line, 1B, both of them use the same melody. And then a new melody is introduced for lines 2A and 2B. And then another new melody is introduced for 3A. And you can keep going like that, but always there's a new melody introduced for each pair. But again, 1A and 1B will have the exact same syllable count. 2A and 2B will have the exact same syllable count, which might be different from 1A and 1B, but the same as each other, so that you can easily sing the melody twice and you hear that kind of structure. So Hildegard uses that structure, but in a little bit more of a vague, loosey-goosey way, let's say. So you have the sense of a melody repeating, but there's a variation on that melody. So, and it's really generated because the syllable counts don't line up, right? So in that pairing of 1A and 1B in this particular sequence, O Euchari and Laeta Vita, the first line has 42 syllables and the second line has 49. Well, of course you have to adjust the melody to account for that change in syllable count. 2A and 2B, well now it's 39 and 56. That's a huge difference, right? So the melody again is really being varied. The same thing in the next pairing, 38 and 29. So the melody really is varied from one to the next. So we can see that variation structure within the sequence. And she does the same thing with the hymns. With the hymns, every stanza will begin the same way, but then there's a lot of variation between the melodies from one stanza to the next. So here we can see a little bit about how she'll do that. So we've got the 3A from, this is another sequence, O Jerusalem, and it begins with that little melodic phrase, and it's a setting of 5 syllables. The second, the paired melody, we can see is a variation of that. It still starts on the G, it goes up to the B, but now go back down to G and back up to B, and then rises by step to the D, repeats the D. We still get this part, but now we go down to B, and repeat it, and we still end on the D. So it's got the same kind of skeleton or framework architecture, but there's quite a bit of interpolation and variation in the melody. And this time there are 10 syllables, but that is a paired, those are paired lines within the sequence structure. So that is really different, right? That's very different from what we see in the standard repertory, and something that definitely makes her music distinctive. So what's the new approach then? So we're approaching things in a computational way. So there's this database, the Cantus database, that I've been really involved in for many years now. And what we've done, so it's a database, it's online. It provides inventories of chant manuscripts. So it means it tells you every chant that's in a particular manuscript. And starting about 10 years ago, we started adding melodies. And so I oversaw the inventory of one of the Hildegard manuscripts, which is often referred to as the Dendermonde manuscript. It has about 55 of Hildegard's chants in it. And so we created an inventory of that manuscript. There's the second of the two main manuscripts of Hildegard's music is called the Reason Codex. It's held in Wiesbaden, and we also created an inventory of that. For both, we put in full texts, and we also transcribed the music. And it's referred to as encoding the music, because it's not just a handwritten transcription. It's using a particular method so that you can search for certain kinds of things within the encoding. And you'll see here a number of familiar names. Nan Zhang was our master's, did a master's in musicology at Dalhousie, graduated in 2015. She did the initial inventory. And then Claire Neal, who graduated the year after in musicology, did lots of proofreading. And Barbara Swanson, who was a postdoc then, is teaching for us this year, also did lots of work on the Cantus database and on these two inventories in particular. So we're using a data set then that we've constructed from these melodies that were encoded in the Cantus database. And we're comparing that music of Hildegard's then to another data set. So that was put together by Andrew Hughes, the late medieval liturgical offices, which everybody calls LMLO. Now, these look like books, so it doesn't really look like there could be anything digital about this, but in the back of these books are floppy disks. And those have been, the melodies are now in a not on floppy disks, but in a digital form that we can use. And so he encoded melodies of chant. There are 6,000 melodies in this data set, and it goes from about the 11th to, say, the 16th century. And he encodes the music in integers. And you see here just a string of integers, but he did also do some encoding. There are a couple of versions, and some you can, the words, like where the melody ends with a particular word, is also included in his encoding. The way that we did it was using something called Volpiano font. So with that, we're taking, so this is one of responsory of Hildegard's, we're converting that into this using the font. So all of those pitches that you see on that staff line, that's just a font. It's not finale, it's not Sibelius, it's just a font. So it's actually quite easy to do. Those are just letters on the keyboard, and you enter just from letters on the keyboard. Now, the one thing is that we all know the musical letters go from A to G, and we've got H's and J's in there. So you just continue up through the alphabet. Like, it's a really simple tool. So that GAC is GHJ, and then BCA is IJH, And then the G's are good, and then H, G, F, E, D, C, and so on and so forth. Now, we also, though, wanted to capture in the melodies, because it's just the melody transcription, not the text. That's in a separate record within the database. So we also wanted to capture word endings. So here we have two words, O, dulcis. So we want to capture where those word endings are, and that's done in the Volpiano font by using three dashes. So 3 dashes on the keyboard equals 3 spaces on the staff to separate out the words. It's kind of ingenious. I didn't make it up, somebody else, but really brilliant way to do it. So, but we also wanted to capture syllables. So we have the word dulcis, which is 2 syllables, and so we capture that with 2 dashes. All the syllables are separated by 2 dashes in the melody itself. And then we also wanted to capture the difference from going from one neum to the next. So separating those out in the melody in case you wanted to go back and see that. We initially did this actually for other purposes than what I'm using it for, but that we have 1 space, then 1 dash, 1 space between those neumes when we transcribe the melodies. So that is how we encode with Volpiano. Now, so we've got this data set, it's in Volpiano, we've extracted everything from the Cantus database into a CSV file or Excel sheet, and then we're doing something called n-gram analysis. And n-gram analysis, the way we're using it, is really just a way to do kind of a gestural or motivic analysis. And n-gram analysis is something that's used actually in a lot of different fields, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But thinking about motivic or gestural analysis, the first attempt actually at doing that for Hildegard's music was in 1922 by this guy called Ludwig Bronarski, who is actually more famous for his editorial work on the complete works of Chopin. But his PhD thesis was on the music of Hildegard. And so he creates these big tables. This is just the first page of 2 pages of motives that he's taken from chants that end with the final C. He did the same thing with motives from chants that end with the final D, and then also motives from chants with an E final, and he does various things with that. But this, as you can see, was a very manual approach. And unfortunately, the one thing he didn't do is explain when he has a variation, because you can see all these weird things like A, and then A1, AE, A1E, and then he's got A2E. He doesn't tell you what the rationale is behind labeling those things as being similar. So I'll tell you a little bit about n-grams then, because that will help you understand what we're doing with it. So you can use n-grams in literature. It's also been used in, like, medical things, looking at, I don't know, cells. But if we take this famous quote, normally n-gram analysis, you would do the entire play by Shakespeare, not just a line, but you'll see how it can be useful. So if we look at 2 grams, so the n you just replace with a number. And so that means we're looking at every group of 2 adjacent words in this string of words. So to be or not to be that is the question. So that's the series of 2 grams that is in that phrase. And what you can see is that to be is the only 2 gram within that phrase that is repeated. And of course, that's the most significant part of that phrase, right? That's why it's so memorable. But there are also 2 grams that begin in the same way, and the be or and be that, and that's also a critical moment in the structure of that phrase. If we looked at 3 grams then, we would take the first 3 words, to be or not to be that is the question. And now we don't have any that are exact matches. right? We have two that are similar, to be or and to be that, but they're not exact matches. And then we have be or not and be that is. They begin with the same word, but then the second and third word are different. So how does this apply musically? So with a melody, some people have done this with intervals and harmonies and that sort of thing, but with a melody, what we're doing then is taking out the first four pitches. That's a 4 gram. So I'm going to just show you 4 grams, but we also did 5 grams, 6 grams, 7 grams, and 8 grams, but showing you the 4 grams. And then D, E, G, A, E, G, A, C, G, A, C, B, A, C, B, C, C, B, C, A, and so on. And you would go all the way through. And in the analysis that I'm going to show you today, we only went to the ends of words. So we didn't go cross over from one word to the next word. So you'd get to the end of O and then begin again with Dulci's compiling the 4 grams. So it looks like this. And we now have, I think it's 34 4 grams in these first 2 words of actually something that's much longer, this responsory. And so then when we start to analyze it, what we can see is that we have just one exact match of a 4 gram in the melody A, C, G, F, which is the beginning of a descending series of 6 pitches. And then at the end of Dulci's, it's the final 4 pitches of a descending series of 6 pitches. And so you have that exact match. But if we expand our thinking to think more broadly about gesture and do what we would call diatonic transposition, not worrying so much about exactly where the semitones are and the quality of thirds, but that we have that same kind of gesture, then, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So let me just jump in here. So we'll go back here. There's our AGFE. And here we have then a table of the top 20 4 grams. And you see the 4 gram, the melody on the left side of the column. The frequency is the number of times it appears in the entire Hildegard corpus. So FEDC occurs 555 times across, it's about 165 or so melodies, which means that of all of the 4 grams in the corpus, it appears 2.6% of the 4 grams that are used in that corpus. So, but what we noticed is that here you've got now actually 7 descending 4 grams going by step that are related through diatonic transposition. And that seems really significant. Clearly, the descending gesture is what's important, not exactly where the semitone is placed. And semitones are tricky when we're talking about medieval chant because people were not consistent about putting B flats in. So it means that really, if you're trying to do things with exact transposition, you can get really messed up. But then we also have this little gesture. And that occurs 5 times in the top 20 if we think about diatonic transposition. And then we have a third one that appears at 4 different pitch levels and in the top 24 grams. So that gives us actually then something that we can look at with some pretty high percentages of appearance in terms of the 4 grams. So that top grouped 4 gram occurs 2,746 times in the Hildegard corpus. 13% of the 4 grams in the Hildegard corpus are a descending tetrachord, we would call it. But now we can also see the comparison with the LMLO. Now, it's a much bigger data set, 6,000 as opposed to what we have with our 160 melodies. So, but we can see the percentage in the LMLO, and we can see that the Hildegard uses it more in terms of percentage. And to make it easier to compare, we've created a ratio of Hildegard to the LMLO. So that first 4 gram, Hildegard uses 1.67 times more right, than in the LMLO. And the second foregram, actually, it's about the same, right? She uses it at about the same rate, same frequency as you find in the LMLO. In the bottom of the top, the third top foregram, she actually uses less frequently than you find in the general repertory. So that's interesting, right? We're actually starting to find some things that might tell us about what makes Hildegard's music distinctive. So we have those three. So then if we have a look at, go back to our foregrams that we took out of this phrase, and we think about that diatonic transposition, we have this gesture, right, that appears twice also in this first phrase. And we have this gesture, which appears twice in that first phrase. And we've got this gesture that actually appears 3 times in that first phrase. I'm just trying to get to my next slide. There we go. Okay, and then if we go back to our initial descending notes A, G, F, E that appeared in exact transposition twice in that first phrase, but we again extend it thinking about diatonic transposition, we can see that actually it occurs 6 times in that first phrase. So it's really a very popular foregram in Hildegard's music. So the other thing that we see, and you saw those overlapping colored boxes, is that we actually also then, if you look at what is overlapping, sometimes we land on longer strings of pitches that are other important n-grams. So this is the third top 8-gram, and it contains our most popular foregram. It also contains our second most popular foregram and our third most popular foregram. So you have this kind of nesting and kind of saturation of these ideas happening musically. So if we go back to this, we can see, gray, yellow, blue. And what does that give us? It gives us the 6-gram now that appears twice within the phrase. And if we look at our descending series that are side by side, then we get another 6-gram, now 6 descending pitches in a row. So if we look at the top 3 grouped foregrams, I've already shown you that, but here are the top 3 grouped 5-grams. And again, we can see some really interesting ratios. So the 5-gram, so now this is the descending, like 5 pitches. So if we had this before, now we have, and now this appears not 1.6 to 1, but 2.3 to 1, like even more, it's much more likely to occur in the Hildegard repertory than in LMLO. And if we look at the top 3 grouped 6-grams, this one is 2.2 to 1, and this one is 5 to 1. Okay, so way more common, right? Much more likely to occur in Hildegard's music than in the general repertory. We go to 7-grams, and again, we see the same thing. Now, the numbers are getting pretty small in terms of the actual appearances of these, but still, it's far more likely for Hildegard to do these than it is when we look in the general repertory. And again, in the 8-grams, we see the same sort of thing, 5.6 to 1, 3.2 to 1. And then we also see this, which looks really weird, right? Only in Hildegard. Kate got very excited about this, and then I said, well, there's this thing when we entered the melodies in vol piano, we really wanted to make sure we captured the quilisma. And so which is a certain neum. So we transcribed it as a double pitch. So that G, G, G is what we'd call a prepunctum, and then it's a quillisma. And Andrew Hughes did not do that in the LMLO. So we need to sort of change our data set a little bit and then do those comparisons again. But one of the things that we saw in those tables and that people talk about with Hildegard all the time is that she uses a lot of descending figures, and you can see them here. And that data that we looked at certainly supports it. So if we look at now comparing these 4, 5, and 6 grams that are similar, so we have now, when you look at the comparison over here, you can see that as the grouping becomes longer, it becomes much more likely to be in the Hildegard repertory than in the general chant repertory. And if we take this one then and do the same thing and extend it out, so a descending line, but coming back up at the end. Again, we see the same kind of thing with the ratios, that every time it gets a little bit longer, Hildegard's more likely to do it. And then if we look at a similar idea, but this time repeating that final note when it comes back up, again, we see the same kind of ratio of Hildegard using it much more often than we see in the general repertory. So what it tells us is what people have been saying but was not quantified, that Hildegard uses a lot of descending gestures. We can actually say in quantifiable terms that is a feature of Hildegard's music and makes it distinctive, that saturation. So we're going to just take a look quickly at how that will play out in a chant. What sorts of things do we see if we look at a particular chant in relation to these motivic ideas? So the one we're looking at is O Dulci Selecte, which you saw excerpts of throughout. It's a responsory for John the Evangelist. The text translated into English is, O sweet elected one who burnt in the glow of the fiery one, a root, and who in the Father's splendor elucidated mysteries, and who entered the chaste chamber in the golden city, which the king constructed when he accepted governance of the regions. Grant aid to the wanderers. Now, this next sentence is the verse, which I'm not going to show you, but for you augmented the rain when your superiors unleashed it on the viridity of the spice sellers, and then we get what's called the repetendum. It comes back, it's like a little refrain, grant aid to the wanderers. So here is that chant, a transcription of that chant. Now, that's that 6 gram that we found, and we can see at that pitch level that it appears this time in a little bit of a variation, the D to F is filled in, and here, and it always appears at the end of a word, right? So that's really interesting. This is like a little cadential gesture that she's using quite frequently. And then if we transpose it and look at it at that other pitch level where we found it, we can see it there and here and here and there. So not at the end of a word in this case, so that is a difference, and that's quite interesting. But when we look at that one that was up on the top, the first one that with a G, B, C, B, A, what's in purple there is actually that top 8 gram that Hildegard uses. And here it is in the chant. And it only appears like this once. So this is one of the constraints then of n-gram analysis, is that it's looking for exact contour. It's not looking for variations. And although this appears only once, we can actually see that if we extend it out, it is on a syllable. We've got this idea, and it appears here, varied. The G isn't repeated, and we see it here. It doesn't start on D this time, but we've got that same kind of gesture. And it's on a word, right? So these are either on a syllable or on a word. We can see her playing around with this gesture. And so here we have it again. The G is not here anymore. And what she's doing with these motives is exactly what I saw her doing in the sequences, right? When she's varying the melodies, she's playing with these ideas and varying them. And so there's another one, here's another one. And at the end, she kind of goes through it twice, and also involves another one of the 8 grams, the one that I showed you that had the overlapping 4 grams, and she does that twice. So she kind of merges those. And then we have a couple of others that might be arguable. I thought they looked very similar. Kate wasn't as sure. So that's, again, something where, you need to decide, okay, what is the same, right? Like, what is similar? How are we making that determination? So what we can see is, all of those statistics suggested to us that there was this kind of saturation of certain motivic ideas. And then when we take one of those and we look at a particular chant and we look at the varied instances of them, we can really see the saturation within a single chant. So I will play this for you now so you can hear how it works. You will have noticed there are a few discrepancies between what you were hearing and the notation. There are two, this is transcribed in two different manuscripts, so there are a couple of little differences, and also they approach the quilismas by filling in the third. So what are the next steps? So what I've talked about today are the things that I think Hildegard does that makes her music distinctive. And what we need to do next is to look at what she doesn't do. So we'll be doing kind of the reverse and starting with the LMLO, finding the top 20 engrams in each of those categories, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and then comparing that to Hildegard's repertory to see what things she's not doing. And that will give us kind of a more complete picture about what makes her music distinctive. Thank you.
So much for a wonderful talk. I certainly have some questions, but I'll open it up to the floor in case there are a great many. And yes, Barbara.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. So interesting to hear the direction that the project has taken. So funnily enough, when you were talking about all of this analysis, it made me think about Hildegard as a singer as much as a composer, because you're showing the recurrence of all these gestures and the way the gestures get elaborated. And it almost looks like you could imagine Hildegard as an improviser who's
Yes.
sort of improvising over these gestures. And so I was just wondering, even though this is in your project, is there much sort of documented about Hildegard as a singer? And would that, and if there was, would that influence how you think about her construction of melody?
It's a really great question, and I think this is something actually that when Kate and I presented some of this research in the summer at the Medieval and Renaissance Music Conference, several people said that it looks like she's a singer, right? And this is something that Margot Fassler's really thinks is certainly one of the features that influences the style of her music. So there is one reference to Hildegard singing. So it's in the Acta Inquisitionis, which was compiled 50 years after she died. And it was really sometimes referred to, it was like a 10-year dossier. It was basically a document that was put together with all of these written works of hers and sent to the Pope so that she could be considered for canonization and to be made a saint. And in that documentation, the investigation team interviewed people from the convent, and one of them said, I remember her walking through the cloisters singing O Virga ac Diadema, which was one of her sequences. So that's the only reference. When she talks about her compositional style, she doesn't really talk about it as such, but what she describes is that she hears this heavenly music, and then in her Scivias, in the final couple of visions of that large visionary work that she wrote, she says, I heard these heavenly songs, and then she writes out the texts, but the texts, they are all also in the music section of the manuscript. So that doesn't really give us a lot. She's just saying, I heard it, which sounds like it's something very external, but I mean, it's also the way that she described everything, right? That she was hearing it from God. She wasn't giving herself credit for any of it. Yeah.
Great presentation. I just really enjoyed it. I'm just curious how, you created this database. And I find it interesting that other scholars could use this, could search, and then really just have ideas of their own, and then they have this incredible resource that they could use to explore their ideas they have. And how you think about that.
Yeah, So I didn't start it. It was started in the 1980s. It's one of the earliest sort of continuing digital humanities projects. And it was started on a mainframe computer at Catholic University in America. And it was, there was just a string, like I think 44, whatever, the width of the monitor was, however many characters you could have, that's how many characters were in there. So it was really just used for these inventories of chants. But then it moved from Catholic University to Western University in the 90s. And Terence Bailey was the one who ran it at that time. And then one of his students later, after she got her PhD, took it over, Deborah Lacoste, and she has been working on it for decades. And so I got involved in it actually with the Salzine antiphonal, so the manuscript that's owned by St. Mary's University, and we wanted to capture that, do an inventory of that in the Cantus database. And just at that time, the Cantus database had created this field so that you could enter melodies. So this was a new thing, and we did it with the Salzine antiphonal. And then I started working with Ichiro Fujinaga at McGill University, who was trying to do something called optical music recognition. And he wanted, so that's where a computer reads the notation in the manuscript for musical meaning, so that you can search the manuscript directly, you don't have to transcribe it. But in order to see how all of that would work, you need to be able to check what the computer is reading, like what its output is, against what people call ground truth. So one of the projects that I worked on, and why there were all of these Dalhousie students who were doing this work, is we were generating ground truth for that OMR project. So entering melodies. So we entered something like 58,000 melodies into the Cantus database. And it is a tremendous tool. But it's been like crowdsourced really since the late 80s. People have been, all sorts of scholars and people have done this in their classes where they've had a group of people work on an inventory. And so it is an amazing resource. And so I kind of got more involved with it at a point when we needed, another grant to keep the database going. And Deborah Lacoste is the project director. She doesn't have an academic appointment at a university, so she needs to be paid to do the work that she's doing to run the database. So there had always been kind of this series of grants. So I got involved at that point. And now what I'm trying to do is we're setting up a governing council for the Cantus database so that there can be some succession planning, because at this point, there are over 500,000 records in the Cantus database. It's a lot of effort, thousands and thousands of hours, hundreds of different people have contributed to it. And unlike a book, which might still be in the library, a database can just, kind of collapse. So we're thinking about all of those sorts of things. But yes, after entering all of those melodies and overseeing the students, at a certain point I thought, I want to start using those melodies and for my own research and see what I can do with them. Thanks.
I'm curious about the motivic gestures that you've identified. And I'm wondering if there's anything beyond the music itself here, the possibility of them having associations with ideas or emotions or that sort of thing. I asked this because half a century ago when I was working on Haydn's symphonies, I discovered similar kinds of things, some of them actually going back, I think, to chant. For example, the figure of a rising fourth and then descending back to the original note, as happens in O haupt vor Brutum Wunden, the chorale tune, which has a very definite death association. And Haydn frequently used those to start the slow introductions of his symphonies. And I think he was doing it with that kind of association in mind. So I'm just curious if you can kind of take that step beyond the music itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing and something we definitely want to do. And that's sort of also maybe one of the next steps is trying to do this sort of closer reading and is there something that we can see? And so far I would say that what I've been seeing is more kind of related to the structure of the text, so that you have this idea that's on a syllable, right? And it comes back on a syllable or a word. It's very clearly related to textual structure, or that one gesture that was used at the end of a word and seemed to be kind of more cadential in nature. There is one really lovely neume in Hildegard's one of her manuscripts, and it's for the word serpent. So it's probably a text about Adam. And the neume, so with these neumes, a lot of times you can keep them going, right? So you have a neume that's sort of this shape, and that it's like a lower neighbor, right? You go down and then you go up, but you can go up higher than just back to the original pitch. And so it does this in the manuscript. She just keeps it going. And it's just so clearly like, it looks like a snake. And so I think that is absolutely a reference. But trying to pull out that relationship, are there certain words that she always sets in particular ways? The one that she definitely does is with the word "o," often that appears it's at the beginning of the chants. And she starts a lot of her chants with the word "o," and frequently that begins with a rising fifth gesture. And it really is this kind of exclamation, like it's, "Oh, beautiful virgin, oh, sweet elected one." It has that kind of, that exclamation. And so I can see that really fitting together, that she's, with that gesture, she's capturing that idea of the exclamation. Thanks.
Wouldn't it be relatively simple to do just vowels?
To-
You have 5 vowels and you tie them to patterns. And we know what the length in Latin was too.
Right.
So that could be, you could easily, if you said O is relatively consistent.
Right.
All the O's in all the, when it's
Right.
as a part of the word.
Yeah. No, that's a really great idea. We could do it. So the one issue is that with the Volpiano font, and it's actually an issue with lots of things, like with the OMR, is that the text, the structure of the text is tied to the font, where the word ends, where the syllable ends, but the word is not tied to the gesture. So, so there's probably a way to do it. We have figured out, so on the Cantus database, I showed you a picture of just the melody, but underneath that, you have the melody with the text. And what we did there is used a Latin syllabification tool. So it took the Latin from the text field, put it into syllables and words, and then we could map that on because the Volpiano had the words and the syllables. So it just sort of shows up in the right place, but it isn't actually tied to the music specifically.
One of the things that I remember from years ago, for instance, is how hard it is for us to simulate Latin verse. For instance, contemporary people, because we don't have a clear sense of what was the expression, phonemic versus syllabic pronunciation.
Right.
It was tricky, but
Yeah.
maybe this could help actually even in reconstructing. I mean, this is
Yes.
medieval, so this is
Yeah.
600-700 years at least after it was spoken, but still.
Yeah. One of my colleagues in Germany, Inga Behrendt, is really interested in that idea of the vowels and stress, and thinks that there's something in Hildegard in relation to that, which would also correspond with this idea of her as a singer. That she's not just like writing a text and then putting it on music. She's actually declaiming the text musically, and then you might be able to see that. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I was really struck by, well, how much time it takes to get to this point. So it's hours and hours of data entry and research and so on. And what struck me is that we're getting closer, you're getting close to having kind of a fingerprint of this is what Hildegard's music was about. Like there's something unusual. And so my question really is, could this be used as a prototype for getting those fingerprints of other medieval composers? So could this be seen as kind of like a trial run? So if it works for Hildegard, can it be expanded in other contexts so that we can do this with a range of medieval composers, maybe slightly different genres?
Yeah, I think it could be. So I'll say two things about that. One is there are a lot of anonymous chant composers. So it could be an interesting approach to try to say, okay, well, these are all in this style and these are all in that style. Whether or not you can say this is one composer, that's another composer, is something else. But there are some other named chant composers, but nobody has quite the, Hermanus's comes the closest in terms of the number of chants that we can ascribe to him. The other thing, and I've seen this, so Julie Cumming at McGill has done this kind of n-gram analysis with intervals. And so it's looking at like a movement, say, from an octave to a fifth to a third. And she's looking at these patterns between voices. And so Palestrina, famously, people argue about what he wrote and what he didn't write. And so she's been using this kind of analysis. And what you can say definitively is this piece doesn't operate in the same way as all the other pieces by Palestrina. But what you don't know is, was that because he was just experimenting and doing something new, or because he didn't write it? So it's that next step, the conclusion, you can never really get to that conclusion.
Yes, I think I was aware of some other people trying to do this kind of thing with Renaissance music.
Yes,
Like,
exactly, exactly, yeah.
It is a bigger question.
Yes,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah,
really
absolutely,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the three students who just stood up are going to pick up our food, which is just arriving. So we do have some refreshments, unusual for today. And we invite everyone to join us in the bar area of the new Strug Hall. So that's where it'll be. And the grad students voted for sushi, so enjoy. So before we get up and go, could we say thank you yet again for this wonderful presentation and for taking time to be here with us. I know that you're probably upset.
Thank you.